Humans have found some pretty inventive ways to keep people in line, from wearing humiliating contraptions in public to trial by combat, and even eating a cheese sandwich. And the punishments only get stranger from there. On this episode of the Infographics Show, we're diving into the depravity as we rank the most bizarre punishments in history. Number 10. You might have heard of the scold's bridle, a contraption women were sometimes forced to wear when they had been accused of talking too much. Mostly a punishment for peasants, a woman would find herself trapped in one of these things for spreading gossip or complaining about the price of bread. It was used throughout Britain, but there's evidence that it made it over the pond to the North American colonies. In 1633 Massachusetts, historical records describe a woman being gagged with a contraption for what was called an evil practice and exorbitancy of the tongue. It was humiliating and even painful, since some of the bridles had an iron spike pressing down on the tongue. One scream in anger and you could be in a whole world of pain. In Middle Ages Germany, they had something similar, a mask of shame or Schandmaske. With these, you could still talk, but you looked monstrous, especially when they were sometimes in the shape of animals, pigs or dogs. And they were fastened with a padlock, making it nearly impossible to sleep in them, let alone put anything in your mouth. Now let's see how a mask could turn into something a lot uglier. Number 9. Medieval punishments weren't just about shame or pain. Sometimes they were pure spectacle. In 14th century France, if a married man or woman was accused of adultery, the couple might be forced to march through the streets tied together, sometimes with a rope attached to the man's family jewels. Records call it la course, or the run. It was less a punishment and more of a gauntlet. Villagers would often hurl things at the adulterous duo or beat them. It was the perfect way for townsfolk to work out their anger issues. But the walk of shame wasn't just embarrassing and painful. Showing your body to all the sundry and possibly getting it covered in filth completely destroyed your reputation. It was the kind of thing it was hard to come back from. They had something similar in Italy, which they called run the town. You would be stripped and forced to run while the entire town did its best to make sure that you reached the other side covered in blood. The Germans, of course, did it with more efficiency. They sometimes brought a donkey, and as the accused rode it through the town, the mob armed with cudgels and stones did their worst. But sometimes great minds think alike. In both Germany and Britain, they had a form of humiliation that consisted of the accused wearing a barrel. The German version was called the Schandmantel, or shame cloak. It usually was reserved for petty crimes, maybe just trespassing or selling your body. If you'd also blasphemed, it might come with some heavy stones or a chain worn around your neck. Known as the Lasterstein or the blasphemy stone. Either way, someone would probably throw things at you or hit you with a stick. Over in Britain, a man who had drunk too much and caused trouble in the pub could end up in the drunkard's cloak, maybe as the wife he'd been arguing with wore her bridle. Sometimes couples were punished together. After an argument, they would be strapped to a seat and dunked straight into the river. As you'll now see, shaming could get much more brutal. Number 8. You know those dreams where you're suddenly naked and everyone's laughing? Medieval punishments took that to a whole new level. Imagine being stripped bare in the middle of town as a baying mob surrounds you, hurling insults and demanding vengeance. And that's not even the worst part. Officers of the law bring out vats of tar and pour it over your body. Then they finish you with a pièce de résistance, covering you in feathers, transforming you into a grotesque human chicken. Makes that naked dream seem pretty harmless now, huh? Tar and feathering first appeared in law in 1189, thanks to King Richard the Lionheart. He ruled that any thief caught sailing with a crusading army bound for Jerusalem would be subjected to it. The law stated that the thief or felon shall be first shaved, then boiled pitch shall be poured upon his head, and a cushion of feathers shook over it so that he may be publicly known. The tar or pitch, usually used in shipbuilding, clung to the skin like strong glue. Victims sometimes had to cut it off, leaving patches behind, even after they managed to strip away the feathers. But this punishment was so effective it spanned centuries. Archibald McCall, a wealthy Scottish landowner in Virginia, angered locals during the Stamp Act crisis of 1765 when he tried to collect taxes. For his trouble, he was tarred and feathered, though he survived and lived until 1814, dying after the Revolution. Turns out, when it came to public humiliation, people thought, why mess with a classic? The next punishment would make 21st century Irish loyalists proud. Number 7. When the Normans took over England in the 12th century, they didn't mess around with punishment. Forget creativity, they just cut off your pride and joy and blinded you. That's allegedly what happened to a man named Eilvard of Westoning after a dispute with his neighbor, Fulk. Eilvard owed him money for plowing, and at a festival the two hit the tavern, got drunk, and as often happened in England, they ended up fighting. Eilvard denied owing a penny and tried to strike a deal. He would pay part of the debt if Fulk spent it on beer. Fulk, no fool, refused. That night, Eilvard burst into Fulk's house ready for round 2, but Fulk fought back, leaving him bloodied on the floor. The constable was called and Eilvard was thrown into a jail cell. With no long-term prisons, justice had to be swift and brutal. Fulk demanded trial by combat, but Eilvard had already been beaten and refused. And that's what could happen when you broke the law back then. Nobles did it to other nobles, but more often it was for peasants. The chronicles show that for offenses as minor as fishing in the wrong pond or angering the wrong man, peasants could be blinded, mutilated, or both. Take Thomas of Ellerfield. Convicted of injuring someone in a fight, instead of hanging him, the judges handed Thomas to the injured man's neighbors, along with a knife, and said, "Do your worst." Now for some very strange justice. Number 6. Before the Norman era was the Anglo-Saxon era. It was still the Middle Ages, but sometimes, and maybe unfairly, called the Dark Ages. There were no police back then, but villages used a system called tithing. Every male over 12 was part of a tithe, and one would report to the local sheriff if someone caused trouble, and that's how order was kept. If someone shouted thief, it raised what was known as the hue and cry. Everyone, even women, was expected to drop everything and chase the criminal. If he wasn't beaten to death on the spot, he faced either trial by judge or trial by ordeal. Sometimes, though, justice could be bought with cold hard cash. You might be able to pay different fines for killing someone or for injuring someone. It worked on a sliding scale. The fines were higher for killing or injuring a noble compared to a peasant. But if you had no money, things gradually became more painful. You could have trial by ordeal, sometimes trial by hot iron. The accused would have to grab a red-hot iron weight, and after the inevitable scream, they would be bandaged up. If after 3 days the wound had more or less healed, they were judged innocent. If guilty, they were executed, usually by hanging. It was supposed to be God who helped or didn't help the person heal, so it was a form of justice that you couldn't argue with. Of course, a lot would depend on how hot the iron was, how long you held it, and how well the wound was bandaged. If you were lucky, someone could secretly tend to your wound, but that would require payment more often than not. It was rough justice. Also, it was open to interpretation just how much the judge said something had healed. This wasn't just an English practice. In 13th century Hungary, records from 1208 to 1235 showed 308 cases of trial by hot iron. Around 100 of the accused didn't even attempt it. Instead, they chose death, believing their guilt meant God would never save them. The records show out of the rest, just 38% were found guilty. So those other people were obviously wrong to not have given it a go. There was also trial by hot water, which worked on the same rationale as the hot iron. The condemned would sink his or her hand into a pan of hot water, sometimes asked to recover a stone, and then they were bandaged. The judges never expected the wound to completely clear, but if it took a while to heal, that meant you were guilty. But not all punishments involved agonizing pain. Number 5. The best trial by far, and probably the one we're sure we could cheat, was trial by bread. Compared to carrying a red-hot iron or being dunked in freezing water, this one sounds almost pleasant, at least at first. It worked like a strange mix between trial and exorcism, centered around what was called an accursed morsel. This usually meant a small lump of bread accompanied by a piece of cheese. The idea was simple: the accused had to eat the food. If they managed to swallow it without choking, gagging, or convulsing like they were possessed by the devil, then God had stepped in and declared them innocent. If not, well, their guilt had been divinely confirmed. The bread wasn't just handed out casually, it was weighed to exactly 1 ounce or 28 grams, and a priest would stand over the accused while uttering a solemn prayer. Then the bread and cheese were stuffed into the accused's mouth, and if they managed to eat it and keep it down, they lived to fight another day and got a free meal. On paper, that sounds like the easiest ordeal to beat, but there were risks. Anxiety, dry mouth, or sheer terror could cause a person to choke, and that was all the evidence the crowd needed. Rumor has it that in 1053, Godwin, Earl of Wessex, choked on his bread while denying involvement in the killing of King Edward the Confessor's brother, Alfred. Those Dark Ages people loved a good trial. Number 4. In the 1200s in Germany, trial by combat was written into the law. If you were accused of a crime and you couldn't prove your innocence any other way, you could literally fight for it. 2 combatants would face off, each armed with a sword and shield, but to keep things fair, they weren't allowed to wear footwear or headwear. They went at it, and whoever won was innocent. This might not seem entirely fair. After all, not all men can fight, so a violent criminal with combat experience could just have a duel, win, and claim God had delivered justice. Well, in a law code written into 1300s Germany, the emperor stated just that it wasn't fair. He banned the practice, although it came back in the 1400s. The powerful didn't always win. There's a recorded case from 1446 in England when a servant accused his master of treason. The master took offense and challenged his servant to trial by combat to prove who was telling the truth. But the master made one fatal mistake. He got drunk before the fight. The sober servant easily overpowered him and killed him. English knights, those men who were easily offended, often asked other knights for trial by combat. They might be able to choose their weapon, so maybe a sword or a spear or a cudgel or even a hammer. They fought in an area of about 60 square feet, and despite what you might think, it wasn't all action. They usually started at midday, but they could fight until sunset. A lot of men died this way, but if you cared more about life than your reputation, you could shout the word craven, which was admitting defeat. And then it was up to the other fighter if he wanted to stop the duel. He could opt to have you punished by another means, or he could keep swinging until one of you was dead. This next one is definitely the strangest. Number 3. One of the strangest punishments in history was what the Romans called poena culei, penalty of the sack. Even for ancient Rome, this was a truly disturbing way to die, and it happened fairly often, usually to people who had committed parricide, the murder of a family member. The Romans had their unique system, which usually involved throwing you into a large leather sack, along with a dog, a chicken, a snake, and if available, a monkey or an ape. And then you were all thrown into the river, where you probably had a very surreal experience before you all drowned. The Romans abolished the practice in the 300s, but it made a resurgence in Europe in the Middle Ages. In the 1300s in Germany, it was written into law in the law book, the Sachsenspiegel. Like in ancient Rome, it was reserved for parricide. Those Dark Age Germans were either cheap or kind because they didn't bother with the chicken, and they replaced the snake with a drawing of a snake. Obviously, monkeys were hard to come by, so they threw in a cat or a dog, but the records showed that the animal might have been placed in a different compartment. Either way, you all died, but the panic fight, the weirdest part, was missing. It remained part of the law for a long time. In 1548, there was a case in Dresden when a young man had murdered his mother. They decided to put him in the sack, and this time they added a cat and a dog. The sack was made airtight too, so it would take a long time to drown. The records show first the executioner paraded him around town before being taken to a bridge over the river Elbe. But when they threw the sack into the water from such a height, it was so compact that it broke open, and out came the man, the dog, and the cat, probably all quite relieved. The report says the animal swam to freedom, but the man was bound by rope, so he didn't get very far at all. If you wanted to kill someone yourself, you would probably opt for this next type of punishment. Number 2. Throughout history, people have been thrown off of cliffs as a form of punishment, but for the bizarre factor, we think death by being tossed out of a window wins. Yep, this was a thing, and it was known as Defenestration. It's believed King John of England, son of King Henry II, did it to his nephew, Arthur I, Duke of Brittany. Arthur had a claim to the throne, so John did what any of us would do and locked Arthur up. John, not wanting to take any risks, sent some of his men around to castrate and blind Arthur, but according to the Chronicle, the hired muscle didn't have the heart to do it. That, in itself, was enough to get you killed. So they made up a story of Arthur dying of natural causes. Arthur was taken to a castle in France and never seen again. Accounts differ, but all agree on one point: Arthur did not survive. One version claims King John himself threw him out of a window. Such executions happened often in Europe. In the 1400s in Prague, there was what we now call the Defenestration of Prague. In 3 separate events, 3 people died after taking a long flight from windows. The best window-throwing take involves King James II of Scotland and his long struggle with the mighty Douglas family. In 1440, the Black Dinner saw the teenager Earl of Douglas and his brother invited to a grand feast at Edinburgh Castle, but the celebration was a trap. The brothers were hauled out and beheaded while King James watched on. The execution had been engineered by his regents. Years later, in 1452, James himself turned on William Douglas, the 8th Earl of Douglas. After luring him to Stirling Castle with promises of safety, James personally stabbed him before letting his attendants have a go. He was stabbed 27 more times and then hit with a poleaxe, and for good measure his body was thrown from a window. Number 1. There are plenty of bizarre medieval punishment devices from medieval Europe, like the pear of anguish, an iron device forced into the mouth or other sensitive parts and then cranked open to tear you apart. It sounds brutal, but there are no documented cases. Then there are the punishments that are just overkill, like hanging, drawing, and quartering. This was the fate that met Scottish freedom fighter William Wallace. But when it came to bizarre punishments and something that really made the dungeon pop, the iron chair had to be up there. The wooden frame was studded with hundreds if not thousands of iron spikes. The amount varied from region to region, proof, if any was needed, that sadism knew no boundaries. The chair also had a hole cut into the middle of the seat where hot coals or fire could be placed. The victim would then be strapped to the chair, the spikes digging into their flesh with every movement. If they refused to cooperate or confess, the straps were tightened, driving the spikes deeper. All the while, flames roasted them from below. The iron chair rarely killed outright. Instead, wounds became infected, ensuring a slow, agonizing death. What made it truly effective, however, was not just the pain. It was the spectacle. Others were forced to watch, to hear every tortured scream. It broke the spirit of the accused, producing confessions, and if not, they would soon find themselves in the hot seat. The Middle Ages had their share of bizarre punishments, but modern times have some strange ones too. Watch weird punishments handed out instead of prison, and see if there's a fate worse than jail. Or click on this video instead.